You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is October 13th, 2022. It's 7:35 p.m. and I think it's still Pacific Daylight Time for another couple of weeks. And we've been talking about view the last few evenings, and I thought I would continue with that. I still wanted to get to the preoccupied view, which we haven't quite grabbed yet. And I think it's an interesting correlation to also then talk about the non-mentalizing modes that Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman developed. Mentalizing, of course, is the ability to track what's happening. Really, what I think about it is you have the capacity to sense something, the object that can be sensed, and when there's contact, consciousness of the sensing experience arises, but it's unfixated, undifferentiated. It's just pure sensing. It's evaluated unconsciously, really, for processing speed. Does it need urgent attention? Does it not matter if we get to it? It's pleasant. Is there time to experience something pleasant? Then it's really processed in that order: urgent, pleasant, doesn't matter. And then it's compared to the perceptual database to see if there's an entry that's close enough to the sensing experience. And then if there is, then the meaning of that conditioned response forms conceptual reality with all of those meanings tied to it. And if there isn't an entry that's close enough, then the imagination fills that in by creating a new stream, a new thread of meaning. So we're relational. The human body is designed to live in complex social networks, and it has a pain response if we're not connected socially. We have these bundles of nerves in our brain that only social animals seem to have, social mammals. And so there's an actual physical structure around this that is imploring us to live. If you think of Darwinism and the distortion that's very common in the West, which is survival of the fittest, what you really have, of course, is survival of the collaborators. And they're the ones who really succeed in the world that we have. And so all of that is just built into this biology of ours. Because we learn so much in the relationship experience, the relationship crucible, when we're born into different family systems, we essentially learn the family system and how that particular group negotiates the world. We are born pretty helpless, entirely dependent on who comes to take care of us. And really, we begin to develop these working models of our sense of self and the sense of the world that we can expect. It comes from the activity of being mirrored in the dyadic relationship with our early caregivers, if, of course, you have that. So you present yourself to the world, and if you have a sensitive enough caregiver, they take that presentation in, they interpret it, they mirror it back to you, and then to complete the cycle of that communication, they respond to the request that you're making. They take care of you. And if they're sensitive enough and responsive enough, then you find that you're taken care of, enough, and kids who are taken care good enough have a tendency of not worrying about whether that care will come or not. We call that a sense of security, that you as an infant can express what you need without even really knowing what that is. And if you have a sensitive enough caregiver, they come, they respond to you, they mirror back to you the request to validate the communication, and then they take care of you in a way that's good enough. 30% of the time or more. So an astonishingly low bar. People who grow up to be dismissing, which we talked about, have a tendency in childhood to be neglected, so that there isn't that sensitive exchange. The nurturance is not really there, but the sustenance is. So the food, the clothing, and the shelter, what's necessary for them to survive and grow into an adult is there. But the interest and the encouragement to touch into what's essential in the experience of you is not valued. But this is a little bit different in people who grow up to be preoccupied. What happens to preoccupied kids is that the care is really inconsistent. Sometimes the sensitive enough care is there, sometimes that care is absent, and oftentimes what happens is there's a misattunement between the caregiver and the infant, so that the caregiver misinterprets or misunderstands what the child needs. And this doesn't result in security, actually. It results in a focus of the preoccupied child on the parent. And often it results in the child beginning to attempt to be what the parent's misattunement represents to them, so that they can be taken care of. The reason that I started talking about this in relationship to the non-mentalizing modes is that one of the non-mentalizing modes is called pretend mode. And in pretend mode, you really tune into the experience of the other person, and then intuit what you think they want you to be, who they want you to be, and then you become that person in order to get care. And with an inconsistent caregiver who is misattuning to you, rather than trying to get them to attune, in some sense, what you do is try to adjust yourself to where they're focusing, what they're interested in. Christian.
George, could you describe a little bit about the parental mind states that lead to preoccupation in the child? So I've heard that like being distracted during care is one of them, but it seems like that wouldn't be enough. And I guess I'm wondering, like, I guess preoccupied attachment styles get passed down, but is it just preoccupied parents that are resulting in preoccupied children? Or is it also, I could imagine, like sort of somewhat dissociated activities, or like more disorganized parents? I don't know. I asked a lot of questions, but can you just talk about the parental mind states that are involved in caring for a child that leads to the preoccupied attachment?
Well, the preoccupation of the parent is what the child learns. So statistically, Mary Ainsworth, who was one of the original researchers in the in-home studies, found that you have an 85% chance of learning the attachment strategy that your primary caregiver has. So that really what we're talking about is a child who has a pretty clean slate in terms of what they know about self and world, learning from somebody the way that adult orientates themselves to the world. So you learn as each of those windows of opportunity open in your development, the strategy that your caregiver is using, because that's the strategy that they have to teach you. But the inability of a preoccupied person to consistently pay attention is, I think, one of the things that makes them so jumpy. Plus, they're going to be preoccupied with their attachment figure, an adult attachment figure usually. So if they're not preoccupied with the child, then they're preoccupied with someone else, and their mind is constantly skipping. Because preoccupied people they get into a switch where the empathetic experience of their attachment figure becomes the dominant experience for them emotionally, and that their own experience becomes secondary. They need actual proximity to the person that they're interested in, so that if it's a couple situation and the parent is preoccupied with their partner, their mind is constantly going to be away from the experience of the child. Is that making sense? So if the caregiver makes the child the object of their attention, then you're going to find some kind of intrusion or role reversing that happens, because the parent needing the care of the child in the same way that they might need the care of an adult partner. Is that helping?
Yeah, and I guess I assume that the parents' misattunement of the child partially stems from them not actually being able to go back to their own like mind state and their own feelings, so that they can see the child's, but they can't properly mirror because they don't go back to their own.
Well, they're not centered in their own experience. They're preoccupied with the experience of someone else. They don't tend to regulate their own experience. They tend to regulate the experience of someone else. An infant might then empathetically touch into the experience of their caregiver, who's preoccupied and dysregulated, but not actually aware of the dysregulation because their focus is somewhere else. So the child has a dysregulating experience. The preoccupied mind is always scanning the environment. It's so that to stay continuously attuned in a way to a child that would be reassuring and feel reliable to the child doesn't really happen. And then also they don't tend, preoccupied people have a hard time presenting themselves authentically. And so it becomes very difficult for a child, particularly as they get older, to really understand what's happening with their parent figure, because the parent figure is not relating that to the child authentically. So you might notice inconsistencies in the way that parents behave. The public appearance that's demanded of the child is very different than the private experience that the child has. The sense of helplessness that the preoccupied parent presents to the child. There is a breaking off point, really. Children under the age of 6 don't really have the capacity to provide much in the way of care to adults, but as soon as they hit 6 or so, they do have the cognitive capacity to mimic those roles better. And so you often see in children of preoccupied parents, at around 6 years old, they become controlling and demanding in a way that it isn't present in earlier kids. But they also tend to adopt that inauthentic expression. They're constantly trying to be the person that the caregiver is interested in so that they can get the attention of the caregiver. Is that making sense? And in the process of that, they lose track of their own beingness. And that's the piece that becomes difficult to overcome. Now, if they're successful at that, and one of the things that happens to some preoccupied people is that they get so good at pretending and so good at presenting themselves as what the caregiver wants, that they come into a very fixed view or fixed belief that the way that you get things in the world is by pretending. And it's very hard to convince them that actually that isn't the best way to get things, that being authentic is a more efficient means of doing that. One of the great persuasions in moving from a preoccupied attachment strategy into an earned secure attachment strategy is giving up on pretend mode, because you recognize that it doesn't actually work better. But I know from my side of things where I work with people that when you have the experience of a lifetime of only getting things from being in pretend mode, it's very hard to change your mind about that. And because you've never actually authentically revealed yourself, the idea of revealing yourself becomes quite frightening. So it can be quite intractable in that way. Is that making sense about? So you have an inconsistent response from a caregiver, you have a misattuned response from a caregiver, and you keep trying to mold yourself into a person that will be interesting to your caregiver and that your caregiver will want to take care of. Most of the time, the strategy that adult preoccupied people use on the organized end of things is helplessness as a way of getting connection, getting proximity. And so you begin to develop a sense of constantly scanning the environment for problems that you can then use to present as a demand for somebody to help you. You do that, of course, because not because you want the problem solved, but because you want the proximity of the person who's helping you solve the problem. So another reason why preoccupied caregivers are inattentive to their children is because they're scanning the environment for problems that they can use in the strategy that they have for connection. And so in infancy and childhood, you begin to learn that I need to have a problem in order to get connected to. And so the child learns helplessness as a way of connecting, as a way of meeting their needs for proximity and soothing. And in that family system, because the caregiver is not actually helpless, they're presenting themselves as helpless, the child also learns that it's the presentation that gets the response that you want. And so you become good at presenting problems. If you remember the foundations of secure attachment, there's a sense of safety, which comes from reliable protective care. There's a sense of attunement that you can get the attention of your caregiver when you need to, and you can have as much of that as you need. And that because you feel safe, you can present yourself authentically. And because you feel a sense of being seen and a sense of being known. But this is something that preoccupied kids don't really have that sense of safety. There's a fearfulness at the core of preoccupation. Because you don't present yourself authentically, there's always a fearfulness that you could be discovered, and if you're discovered, you could be abandoned. So you don't get that reassurance of being completely open and a sense of being seen and being safe that relaxes that tendency. One of the things that happens to preoccupied adults certainly is that they don't get emotionally regulated reliably by their attachment partners. And they also don't then provide, because they don't really know how to do it, a consistent emotional regulating environment for their children. And so their children don't learn to adequately regulate themselves. They become dependent on the caregiver, another person, to regulate them. This completely constricts their capacity to explore because they can't regulate themselves while they're exploring. Is that making sense? And then the fourth one that's so important is an expressed delight that the caregiver has for their children, so that the child's expectation, no matter what happens, is that their caregiver has the capacity to delight in their beingness, in just who they are. And this is one of the great deficits of preoccupied people. They don't really have much sense of being delighted in, because they always had to present a problem in order to get attention. As adults, of course, if your main means of getting connection and attention is by presenting a problem, people are not delighted to see you. When you figure out that actually, if I can present a problem that has no solution, then the need for proximity will never end. And so I can have all of the proximity that I want. People really become unhappy about that. People don't like to be presented with unsolvable problems and a moral demand that you solve it. It makes them feel helpless. We don't like, generally, we don't like the sense of feeling helpless. We like to have a sense of being capable. And so you'll notice that because of that absence of delight, which is one of the central currencies of secure functioning relationships, secure people have a hard time being in relationship to a preoccupied person. The pretend mode, something happens. If you're not so far down the rabbit hole where you don't no longer know what your authentic response is, what arises is your authentic response to the conditions of the present moment. And then if that increases the abandonment here, that the idea is that if you were to express that, that you risk abandonment, then the inauthentic expression arises in the mind. If you push into that, it immediately relieves the abandonment terror, but you've not expressed yourself authentically. So down the line, you're a little bit angry about that. You don't ask authentically for what you need. You don't present yourself authentically. You don't feel seen. You don't feel safe. And so you tend to get angry about that. If you do push into the authentic response, the abandonment terror intensifies, and then you're sideswiped by a wave of terrible sadness. And the sadness that's related to preoccupation as you begin to come out of it is that over and over again, you were the one actually who abandoned yourself. You were the one who didn't ask for what you really needed. So you don't really ever know whether you could have gotten it or not, because you don't actually go for it in a way. And that's the origin of the terrible sadness for preoccupied people. So the idea here is to begin to mentalize in a way that you can see these things happening, that you can see what your authentic response to the present moment is, and that you can push into it, even though it creates the experience of abandonment here, that you can develop the skills to regulate that experience enough that you can tolerate making an authentic expression, and that you can ride out the sadness that follows and come into a sense of security over and over again. Each time you do it, of course, the intensity of the abandonment here and the intensity of the sadness minimize until it's not actually a big deal to be authentic. But you do have to reclaim each piece of your authenticity. It's not a global shift. Is that making sense? But part of it is a decision, really a conscious choice to begin to give up on pretending and to actually make a risk of expressing yourself authentically. Christian.
George, do you think of there being an actual, like, a sensible order to work on the 5 conditions of secure attachment with someone who's preoccupied?
Well, it's fine to develop them in the order that they're set up, looking for security first, sense of safety. The sense of safety comes from actually expressing yourself authentically. Ironically, maybe. Let's just say it's ironic. You're pretending because you think that's the thing that's going to preserve the relationship, but that's actually the thing that causes the anxiety about whether the relationship is reliable. So you need to change your mind about that. I find that you actually have to hold, you have to make a conscious choice to begin to present yourself authentically. Because if you don't, the mind is easily persuades itself that the right inauthenticity is what's going to work. All right, you caught me there. What do you mean by authenticity? Okay, I'll be that now. Who do you want me to be? I'll be anything. What do you want me to do? I'll do anything. Is the voice of inauthenticity. And really what we're talking about is not that you pull the scroll of every vile thing you've ever done and get them to initial next to each entry so that it's clear that they know that about you and they won't abandon you because of it. What it is that you can present to them a complete and accurate representation of what your experience of the present moment is. You don't have to go through the litany. You just have to be able to say what's happening for you now in this moment. And of course, intimacy is developed, so you need to communicate it in a way that's appropriate to the agreement of the relationship that you have at the moment that you're doing it. Is that making sense? A lot of times with preoccupation, you want to just sort of do a data dump of every problem that you can foresee happening in the relationship so that you can regulate the anxiety of being abandoned. And actually, what you want to do is see the other person and see the agreement of the relationship that you have and communicate in a way that's in agreement with that. That would be what we would call collaborating. That you recognize what the agreement is. You may have had an experience of feeling vulnerable or feeling a kind of emotional hangover from being too intimate too quickly in a relationship. So you want to really be able to regulate that exchange so that it matches the agreement, and the description that you give of the present moment is in the context of that agreement. Is that making sense? And then also, if you can't do it, which is often what happens at the beginning of this process, that as soon as you recognize you haven't done it, you correct it. Stan Hacken says that there's a 3-minute rule in an intimate relationship. You can say something, and if you take it back within 3 minutes, it's fairly negotiable. And if you wait longer than that, it gets harder and harder the longer the time passes, because the response keeps getting, and the other person keeps developing. The reason that preoccupation is harder to address than somebody who has a dismissing strategy is that dismissing people already know how to explore. And so really the adjustment is simply into exploring things that have intrinsic meaning, rather than exploring in a way that you're able to procure supplies to transact the things that you need. But preoccupied people often have a limited capacity to explore. And so in addition to having to learn security, in addition to having to present yourself authentically, you have to figure out how to explore in the first place. And then you have to do that before you can then begin to really orient your exploration toward things that are meaningful. And so there's a lot of risk in that, a lot of risk in learning to explore that dismissing or secure people don't have. Keith?
George, could you say more about the primacy of exploration between dismissing and preoccupied people? And I think what I'm kind of trying to get at is why it's easier for dismissing people to not to explore, but to move towards security because of that capacity.
Dismissing, the cause of dismissing attachment strategy is neglect, profound neglect. But one of the things that happens with that neglect is that the caregivers don't interfere with the child's exploration. So a child who's neglected is then free to learn to explore in a way that children who grow up to be preoccupied are not allowed. There's a role reversing sometimes, and so the caregiver requires proximity of the child in order to feel emotionally regulated. And so they inhibit the child's capacity to explore. They either do that by restraining the child or by being, we call it overprotecting the child. They're too afraid that something will happen to the child, and so they restrict the child's capacity to explore because they need the proximity of the child. So we talk about these 3 dimensions or these 3 domains of skills that you need in order to function securely. One is a good attachment system, one is a good exploration system, and one is a good collaborative system. Secure people come out of childhood with all 3 of these developed, and then as you look at the other attachment strategies, they're not so developed. Dismissing people tend to suppress their attachment system, so that's something that needs to be worked on. They tend to have a good exploration system, but it's oriented toward resources, so we would usually call it a secondary exploration, not a primary exploration. But the skill of exploring is there, and then they tend not to be collaborative. But if you were to say to a dismissing person that collaboration in relationships is a better way to go, they already have the skills to explore that and discover that for themselves. So they can discover that actually a collaborative relationship system is better for them to be able to get what they want. And then you can also describe to them a way in which having secure attachments is a better way to go than auto-regulating and being disconnected. And so because they have the capacity to explore, they can begin to open up to the emotional experience of attachment. They can begin to see the value of having supportive relationships and how that actually increases their own capacity to explore. And you can also persuade them pretty easily that that because they can be in a collaborative relationship, they don't need to spend all of their exploration energy procuring resources to transact their relational needs. They can actually get into a collaborative situation, and that will free up energy for primary exploration, where the activity itself is meaningful. You can't actually do that with somebody who's preoccupied because they don't know how to explore. So that if you were to say to them, collaborative relationships are a better way to go, they don't have any way of verifying that that statement is true or not, because they can't just go explore that. So what needs to happen first is to begin to support the capacity to explore, so that they then can begin to validate in a direct way the experiences that you're describing to them. That's the main issue there. The other thing is that preoccupied people are dependent on external regulators. And so the movement away from that dependency into autonomy is often quite frightening. And the skill set of emotional regulation that allows the autonomy to explore is not there. And so the emotional regulation piece also has to accompany the capacity to learn to explore. Without that, they stay connected to their attachment figures. And also understand that if you're dependent on somebody else's emotional regulation, they also get something out of that, and they may be reluctant to allow the preoccupied person the space to begin to learn the things that they need to learn to be autonomous. Somebody who has a connection to a preoccupied person that has the constant proximity of the preoccupied person and the constant emotional regulation of the preoccupied person might not think that their autonomy is a particularly good choice for them and might attempt to inhibit it. Is that making sense?
Yes.
So there's a lot of scaffolding that preoccupied people need in order to be able to move toward autonomy that dismissing people already have. And what you're trying to persuade a dismissing person is that they can rely on people, that they weren't wrong in their analysis of the family system that they grew up in, that the caregivers were not reliable, but that some people are reliable and that they can count on them. With disorganized people, the problem is not as simple, because the fearfulness of disorganized people is so great that in order for them really to try any of this stuff, you need to begin by helping them manage the fearfulness. One of the things that happens to disorganized people, which does happen to everybody, of course, but in a more pronounced way, is that relationships go so poorly for disorganized people that they begin to accumulate a disappointment about how relationships are going to go. And what you see quite often in that population is that by their mid-30s, the amount of disappointment that they've experienced in relationships is so great that they don't want to risk having to have that accumulated experience of disappointment again, and so they really withdraw from trying to make relationships work. And so with disorganized people, you have to scaffold them so that they're willing to risk the disappointment of a relationship not working, and provide them with a different skill set or an education around a skill set so that they can try again and not ultimately have the same failing experience that they've had so often. The mentalizing piece is important. The further away you get from security, of course, the lower the capacity to mentalize. Disorganized people don't mentalize very well, and so it's much harder for them to make all of these discernments, whereas a dismissing person also mentalizes much better. The dismissing person's mentalizing is usually quite close to what a secure person's mentalizing would be, so that you also don't have to train the mentalizing as much for them to be able to choose differently. But why don't we stop there? That seems like enough of a description for one night, and then we can do some meditation. I guess my thought is that we should do some mentalizing practice. This is an insight practice. We call it investigating self-generated emotion. So what we're going to do is begin by tracking thinking and working mainly with auditory thinking tonight. But we'll do a few minutes of breath counting just to settle the mind, and then switch in. I don't think I need to give you any advanced instruction. It's pretty straightforward. So go ahead and take your meditation posture. So how did that go? Thank you for coming. Let's see. We have our first level 1 class for that we're offering in Central European time starting in a few weeks. Maybe you're a night owl and getting up at 1 in the morning and staying up until 10 in the morning. It sounds appealing to you. But if it doesn't, and you know some people that might be in Central European time who might be interested in it, you might not point them in our direction. We're going to be doing some level 1 series next year, and also I have a new book coming out which is called Punch Outs, which you're going to launch in January, I think, and so take a look at that. It's the main title is Punch Outs, and the subtitle is Tajapanati in Pali. Tajapanati is a Pali word that means to constantly reference, which is the Taja part, and Panati is conceptual reality. So constantly reference conceptual reality and compare it to ultimate reality to make sure that the reality that you're creating is an accurate representation of what's happening. So I like to think of it as a kind of rocking back and forth. This is what I'm sensing. This is what I've made it into. This is what I'm sensing. This is what I've made it into. So it's a collection of photographs that are intended to activate that experience of, this is what I am seeing, what's actually there. This is what I've made it into, what's actually there. So hopefully that will be useful. So I think that pretty much covers the next little bit of what's coming up. We haven't really locked down the dates for the for what's coming next year, but we will do that over the coming weeks. I do offer the teaching on a dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity, so I offer the teachings, but I do hope you'll support me and also support the work that Mettagroup is doing, and you can do that with a link on the website. Christian?
Is the Asia trip still in the cards?
It is, would be in February or November, depending on what happens. We weren't able to do it in Vietnam. The retreat center that we wanted to go to had a lot of flooding in the rainy season, and so they said that they wouldn't know whether they could host us until they see what's left and what they can rebuild. That seems a little dicey to me. We do have an invitation from an abbot at one of the meditation centers in Thailand, but it's a little short on time, and I'm trying to see whether we can lock in the things that we need to so that it would feel comfortable. But probably 18 days in February is what we're working on. And then if it goes well, we might do the whole month of November next year too. So it's a big monastery. It's one of the abbot has invited us to be their guests at the monastery, and then I also like to do a little bit of travel, so try to organize that. But that's what I meant really by we should have it locked down in a couple of weeks, and I'll let you know.
Right on.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, George.
We'll see you soon, I hope. Bye.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.